Good afternoon, Ms. Freeman.
Good afternoon.
Ms. May.
Thank you, Lord. Ms. Freeman, one of the consequences of a lunch break is it enables counsel for the various call participants to propose extra questions for me and me to go and look at extra documents. And so what I might do is spend a few minutes sort of jumping back what we've already looked at.
Okay.
The first question relates to, I think you've described in some detail how you learned of events and how particularly the particular impact the meeting in January 2019 had on your understanding of what were the issues and our concerns about the health board.
Mm-hmm.
It's been put to me that Professor Cudahy wrote to the then chief medical officer actually before you were appointed in June of 2018 and wrote a long letter which hasn't made it into a bundle, in which he sets out, for various reasons associated with his daughter's care, the belief that no one in the health board has a grip of the situation. And I think it's fair to say that's not that's a widely held view amongst parents at that time. What awareness did you have before decant that there was a view that the health board didn't have a grip of the situation in Schiehallion?
I don't think I had much, if any, awareness that that was a widely held view external to Scottish Government. What I think I did have was an awareness that there was a growing concern on the part of my senior advisors that perhaps the health board didn't have a grip.
What I've been asked to put to you is that it should have been obvious to the Scottish Government in the summer of 2018, not January 2019, that the health board may well not have had a grip on the situation, and that action should have therefore happened even earlier than they did. How do you respond to that?
I think if I was either a young patient or a family member of a young patient, that may well be a view that I would share. I think from the point of view of senior officials in Scottish Government, I'm hesitant to speak on their behalf, but also on my own behalf in the summer of 2018. From my point of view, I was still getting to grips with what the situation actually was, what had gone before, where were we, and conscious that I was relatively new in the role, and that views that I had entered the role with, for example, that health boards are not autonomous bodies, needed to be tempered with the reality of being the Cabinet Secretary and taking responsibility. And I think there is a style, an approach in health, certainly at that time in the directorate, the health directorate, which is to provide support, advice, but encourage boards to act on their own behalf.
Do you think, in a sense, there was a reticence about stepping in too fast?
There would be a reticence about stepping in too fast, and that is partly a reasonable reticence because evidence is needed to justify doing that.
Thank you. Another question I've been asked to raise, it relates to your discussion about the importance of asking questions when obtaining assurance that things have happened when you sit on a board or hold a job like the Cabinet Secretary. If you make assumptions that things are being done without asking questions, what do you see as the likely impacts or risks of doing that in the health sector?
So I think the risks will range from relatively minor to severe, depending on the situation. I don't think it is good enough to accept an assurance at face value And I don't think it is good enough to operate on the basis that, well, nobody raised a problem with me, so there can't have been one. If you're the Cabinet Secretary, your job is to gather information from as wide a range of sources as you can. Hence meeting the families, hence meeting the whistleblowers. There are good reasons for doing that in and of themselves, but there's also the reason of gathering as much information and different perspectives on a situation as you possibly can to help you form a view about the situation and about what you should do about that. And I think that applies to others in situations where their role carries significant responsibility.
Such as chairs and chief executives.
Indeed.
Right. The next issue was attempting to work out this board meeting that you had attended. Now, there was a moment of excitement when I thought it was the 24th of October 2019, but I don't think it is. But I'll just set out some more information I've learned. It's not in a bundle. It will get into a bundle. We found the document, which is a mid-year review meeting at Atlantic Quay on the 24th of October, attended by the chief executive and chair of the board, you, Mr. Wright, Mr. Conahan, Mr. McCallum, and for note-taking purposes, Dan House. It's quite a substantial bundle of papers. It covers a huge range of issues, not just Schiehallion, but it's not a board meeting.
Yeah.
We've also, and we will, I think, produce it because in it there's a report from both the CNO and from the board on the issues in Schiehallion as they then stood. So that's quite handy. We will produce that. We also look through all the board minutes, which we have across various bundles. And at no point in a formal meeting are you minuted as being present. And I'm just wondering whether it might have been a board seminar that you attended.
No, it wasn't. It was a board meeting, and it was in the HQ of Greater Glasgow and Clyde, which is in the grounds of the Royal Hospital at Gartnavel.
Thank you. Would it be possible after this hearing for you to, would your old diary still be available to you?
Yes, they should be.
I wonder if someone might look at
Yes.
that for you and perhaps ask Scottish Government solicitors to write to us with that date to just help to bring the chronology together. Now, the next thing is that we were talking about the escalation that we haven't yet reached to stage 4. And in paragraph 47 of your statement, you address escalation. We've obviously had evidence from both Mr. Wright and Professor McQueen, actually there was, and I'm not going to go through this in a huge amount of detail, but I want to ask you some questions about the nature of the escalation and why particular steps were there. So the letter sent to the board is Bundle 52, Volume 1, Document 23, page 310. And we see that Mr. Wright has set out I think over the page there might be further information. No, that's the report that goes back onto page 310. Am I right in thinking that the escalation was effectively in respect of IPC issue?
Yes.
Yes. So at the point you make this escalation, or not you don't, but would you accept that you would have had input in the decision?
I would have
Had input into the decision?
Yes, I did, yes.
Is there a sort of political reality that a Director General is probably not going to escalate without taking the Cabinet Secretary with them?
That's probably fair, but equally, the Director General is not going to escalate beyond what they believe to correct.
Yes.
The level, regardless of what Cabinet Secretary says.
So that, in a sense, the Cabinet Secretary can escalate to stage 5 if they want to, but the Director General goes where they want to go, having had conversations and discussions.
Yes.
Right. At this point, so this is 22nd November, to what extent did you have confidence in the governance of the board at board level around the issues involving the Queen Elizabeth and the RHC?
So I don't have a great deal of confidence, but I have confidence in the escalation to level 4 because it will bring into play the oversight board, and allow the appointment of Professor Bain and effectively remove the actions necessary on infection prevention and control to the oversight of that board and those individuals. But the board does remain responsible for infection prevention and control.
Can you explain why the remit of this oversight board and this stage 4 doesn't extend to explicit supervision or oversight over the rectification of issues in the water system as a whole?
No, I can't.
Or the ventilation in wards out with Schiehallion?
No.
Or indeed, actually, explicit reference to the rectification of Ward 2A and 2B? It's not explicitly within the scope of the oversight board.
It's not in the terms of reference?
Well, it is to some degree. Let's just go and look at those, which is we'll find it in the oversight board itself. So that's bundle 6. Document 35, page 700. I'm just going to check another document because I've just missed a note out of my notes. Well, someone reminds me of that bundle reference. I'll talk to you. We'll talk about the water system as a whole, and we'll come back to that one. There'd obviously been a water incident that had started before you arrived, and there'd been the DMA Canyon reports.
Yes.
Can you help us whether there was any thought about putting the supervision, the support of the oversight board over the whole recovery of the water system for the whole hospital?
I can't recall whether there was or not.
Do you think that might have been a good idea, given that it's a single system?
At this length of time since that discussion, I don't think I can reasonably answer that question, yes or no.
Similarly, you by this point knew the extent to which there were issues with ventilation across the whole hospital. And indeed, you'd appointed the independent review. Now, I appreciate we asked you whether you should have looked at identifying what needed to be done to rectify the ventilation systems. There doesn't even seem to be, for example, the management of the ventilation system across the whole hospital and risk assessments within the remit of the oversight board. Is there a reason why that step wasn't taken?
Again, I'm afraid I can't answer you. The terms of reference of the oversight board would have come to me following discussion between Mr. Wright and Professor McQueen. And I can't recall a discussion with them about what else may have been in those terms of reference that weren't.
Because when we pressed Miss McQueen about it, I gained the impression that the oversight board idea comes out of her work as chief nursing officer with the responsibility for healthcare acquired infections and whether they were being properly handled. And in a sense, that's why it does what it does, because it comes from that place. Does that accord with your sort of understanding of what it was for?
So, excuse me, the chief nursing officer is the lead advisor, policy official on infection prevention and control. And so the escalation to level 4 was primarily around those issues, which would make it logical that she would then be the chair of the oversight board, and the oversight board would be addressing those matters. There may be, notwithstanding that the independent inquiry or independent review had been set up, there may still have been an inadequate appreciation of the role of the built environment with infection prevention and control, to the extent that you would then include that. Now, I'm surmising. I cannot say if that is definitely the case.
Because when one looks at, well, if one looks at, we can look, for example, I think I put it in the document list, at your statement to the Parliament. It was in the official report, which I think might have gone in the documents list. So how did you, while I find that reference, were you presenting the oversight board as simply dealing with infection prevention control or something wider?
When?
When you were announcing it and setting it out for the benefit of those who were listening to your decision to introduce it.
So we need to go back to the statement I made to Parliament. I don't know if that would be the 20th of November statement.
I think it is. Just find it on the document list.
No, it's I think it is February.
Because when you made a statement to Parliament when the oversight board was originally established, did you?
Yes.
I know we have the draft of your statement in a bundle, and somebody will pass to me, I hope,
It's a ministerial statement on the 10th of December,
yes,
2019, where I advise Parliament that the board has been escalated to stage 4 for infection prevention and control and engagement and information with patient and families.
Yeah, so if we look at the terms of reference, that's Bundle 52, Volume 1, Document 4, page 24. And go to page 25. We see the terms of reference focusing on, well, the Oversight Board will seek to ensure appropriate governance is in place for IPC management control, strengthen practice, improve how families are being monitored by the service, confirm that relevant environments at the Queen Elizabeth RHC are and continue to be safe, oversee and recommendations of further action to review cases, right oversight with connected issues. Now, what I'm pressing you on here is that whilst the 4th bullet point there, confirm that relevant environments at the RHC are safe and continue to be safe, that reads as if it's focusing really just on 2A and 2B and not the wider system. You'd accept that?
No, I don't think I do. I think you can read it as focusing on the areas of the hospital where infections have emerged that cause concerns. At least those areas, so that is wider than 2A and 2B. It potentially does include, as you've asked earlier, water, but it could include the wider hospital. But I don't recall specifically if it did include the wider hospital.
Okay. The other issue is it doesn't explicitly include the concept of the whistleblowers and how they were being treated and whether there was an issue of culture in the organisation. Now, would you accept that given the meetings, the conversations, the email exchanges you had with Dr. Peters, Dr. Redding, and the meeting you had with them, and then with Dr. Inkster and Dr. Peters in the autumn, you would have been well aware that there was a viewpoint that the Health Board was not welcoming internal criticism?
Yes.
Yes. So when I pressed Professor McQueen on this, she accepted that the Oversight Board didn't, as it were, completely resolve this issue. But it isn't actually jumping out within its remit either.
No, but I think you have correspondence from either myself or between myself and those doctors or with Professor McQueen.
No, we do. You're right. Yes.
That indicates that I had sought for the Oversight Board to hear their concerns and involve them.
And there is a debate about the extent that took place.
Yes, there is.
But the point, I suppose, that occurs to me to put to you is that whilst things were done by the Oversight Board, the Oversight Board doesn't appear to have managed to resolve the issue of the culture within the board. Would you accept that?
I would, and I think in fairness to the Oversight Board, arguably there were two points. Arguably, there were more pressing matters in terms of patient safety for them to oversee and resolve. And secondly, they barely had their feet under the table when we faced a global pandemic, which inevitably delayed, skewed their practice and the numbers of people they could pull into a system.
But a possible alternative I put to you is, given that you had awareness and your team had awareness of culture issues dating back to the starting of the Sturrock report in the previous year as an issue within the health service, and you described it in quite some detail, might it have been an oversight to miss out from this reference of the Oversight Board a particular requirement to look into culture within GGC?
No, I don't think it was a mistake to omit that from the role of this Oversight Board. What I had in mind is that we would run a repeat exercise of the Sturrock review in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, in parallel, separately, but in parallel, recognising that this is a much larger board. And so to do that properly would take time, but should be begun. But we never got to that point.
In partly because of the pandemic?
Yes.
So when you come to make the escalation decision, or rather Mr. Wright comes to the escalation decision, that is a few days after Ward 2A has been reopened to new admissions. You're aware of that?
Yes.
Yes. So if we think about the factors that are playing around, to what extent does the fact that Ward 2A has been reopened render some of these issues moot, and actually you didn't need to go to stage 4 because you'd managed to reopen the ward, things were improving, actions were being taken on the water system, Professor Steele's management list was being worked through. In a sense, could it be that your escalation was unnecessary?
No, I don't believe so at all. I think there is an argument that the escalation could have happened earlier, but not a reasonable argument that it wasn't necessary at all. And if you look at the terms of reference of the Oversight Board, regardless of whether a ward has reopened or dosing is now happening to the water system, that I think was recommended in 2017, in fact, by DMA Canyon. Regardless of that, all of these things still need addressed because they go to the heart of some of the challenges that we are dealing with in Greater Glasgow and Clyde.
And so what I want to understand is what of the various threads of information that you and Mr. Wright and the Chief Nursing Officer are receiving play a role in this decision. So we've heard from Ms. McQueen that her concerns about non-compliance with reporting requirements dating back 2015 played a role. Were you aware of those?
Yes, I was.
To what extent, what role did the views of patients and their parents have in the decision to escalate?
A significant role.
And that's following the meetings that took place.
Following the meetings that took place, following the other information that came to me from both MSPs, but also in some instances directly from families themselves or from Professor White.
And is that as a result of his involvement with communications with the
Yes.
family? So he's reading their communications effectively
He
because
is,
he's in
and
the Facebook group.
But he's dealing directly with families, asking them what questions they want answered, then trying to get the answers, getting that through to the families, dealing with the communications team in the health board itself. So he's doing a great deal of work that is direct contact with families.
And what role did the epidemiology and the HPS review, that's bundle 7, document 6, page 214, have in?
So all of these reports all have a cumulative role, if you like, in taking us to a position where escalation to level 4 for the reasons set out at that time is, I believe, the right decision to have made.
Right. Now, again, to revisit the question of whether it's the right time. I know you've already, to some extent, addressed this, but if we think about a lot of these information sources, they actually existed from some time before. So the family's concerns existed before. HPS's reports about the environmental systems existed before. Your concerns about the way that the board was approaching matters existed before. The whistleblowers had been in touch before. To what extent is this potentially, was a lag in escalating because of this continued desire to let the board have its autonomy and to give them a chance to resolve things?
So I think I'd say two things. I mean, first of all, from my perspective as the Cabinet Secretary, the family's concerns were crystallised for me at that meeting in September and then in October, which is not that long before the escalation decision is actually made. The whistleblowers, as we've gone through before, in the detail that they had to offer, came to my attention around about the time of the independent review being announced. Again, not that long. There is a cumulative sense of the board not having a grip. We've discussed this already about why that might be the case, whether it is capacity or attitude. My own view is that it is more attitude than capacity. So as all of that gathers, you then get to a point of saying, we have to escalate now in order to more directly intervene, because everything that has been tried up till now, the board is not responding to this in the way that we need them to respond.
So the Oversight Board is set up. We've heard evidence from Professor McQueen and other members. We looked at the minutes and we've looked at her recommendations. I want to look at the second escalation. Now, there is a document which we'll put on the screen now, which is a letter from Mr. Wright, dated the 24th of January 2020. It's not yet in a bundle, but it will be soon, I hope. And so what is this escalation?
So you recall from the paper that Professor McQueen put to the Directorate's management body,
Yes,
to argue for escalation to level 4 for infection prevention and control and communication with families, that in that paper she said there is no systemic evidence of this board not performing well in other areas. So that's why it's
yes, we've been to that with her.
right. So subsequent to that, from the Chief Operating Officer of NHS and member of the Directorate, John Conaghan, who is responsible and concerned with performance of all health boards. And that's performance in relation to the targets set for them, and be it on finance, be it on waiting times, whatever. He brings forward a paper to that body that says the performance of Greater Glasgow and Clyde is not good enough, and everything we have tried so far has not improved that sufficiently. So I now want agreement that we escalate the board as a whole to level 4. And this time, it's not just about infection prevention and control, it's about performance. And that's what that letter is concerned with.
Does that pose any concerns in terms of confusion? In that the main oversight board is meeting as an oversight board, it ultimately will produce a report. It's addressing IPC adjacent issues. And of course, the pandemic will come along and disturb everything. But at this point, probably just getting into your weekly briefings. What is it, 3rd week of January? You're beginning to get the worrying signs. So is there any risk that having 2 oversight boards at the same time, where one is almost within the scope of the other, in a sense, because one's the whole board and one's a subset of it, might have caused confusion?
I don't believe so, because the areas are they're obviously in practice connected. How well you do on infection prevention and control does have an impact on how well you meet your performance targets, clearly. But they are equally discrete in a sense. And the letter and the escalation was clear that on the question of the plan to improve performance, that would be overseen by a group chaired by Mr. Conaghan, and would have operating to it Callum Campbell as the turnaround director. And so he would take over responsibility for the delivery of the improvement plan on performance, which would allow Ms. Grant to focus on what needed to be done by way of leadership on infection prevention and control and communication with families.
And
so I don't think, I mean, I accept that.
Do you think Ms. Grant
from the outside it may appear confused? I don't believe for 1 minute the board was confused.
Do you think Ms. Grant saw her role as shrinking and effectively handing over most of the board's operations to Mr. Conaghan?
I don't know whether she saw it in that way or not.
Let's we want to be clear, one particular issue. Obviously, we know there's a programme. It's reported regularly to board meetings to address some of the physical defects in the building. A lot of work on water, sequentially through wards, there's litigation, all these things are running on. Do they fall under the remit of this oversight board, or the first one, or neither?
So in a sense, litigation doesn't fall under the remit of either of the boards. The health and safety executives' intervention and engagement is also a separate but parallel issue, that it is important for government, but also the board chaired by Professor McQueen, to be aware of, insofar as it is possible to be aware of how that is progressing. But the maintenance programme is, where relevant, for the board overseen by Professor McQueen, because it relates to the fabric of the building, the maintenance of that fabric, and as we've seen and discussed, that has a direct connection with effective infection prevention and control.
So before the pandemic intervenes, we should see the intention as all the work being done by Professor Steele to address, in the broadest sense, deficiencies in the building falling to some extent within Professor McQueen's oversight board's remit? And to the extent it affects risk to patients?
So,
to the extent it impacts on risk to patients?
yes.
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 Now, ultimately, the pandemic did intervene. And we've obviously heard evidence from the oversight board of how their meetings stopped for a period. I asked you about leadership and culture, rather, and you expressed the view that to some extent it was the pandemic that intervened to stop some of that work. Now, there's somebody writing a transcript and nodding sagely, while going, it's going to make their life harder. So
sorry, I'm very sorry. Yes.
What I want to turn to now is paragraph 50 of your statement, where you touch on the idea of whether there should have been an escalation to stage 5. So what would you have understood the escalation of stage 5 to involve?
So escalation to stage 5 is where Scottish Government intervenes directly and takes over directly the running of a health board.
Is that by replacing the board members by new board members, or literally taking over and standing in their shoes?
It can be either. It can be, as was the case with Argyll and Clyde Health Board, when Mr. Kerr was the health secretary, the closing down of that board in its entirety.
And splitting it to other boards.
And split it. Clyde came to Greater Glasgow. So it is for the relevant minister to decide how they want to intervene and what they want to do as a consequence of that intervention.
So did you think about stage 5 as an option at the time?
I did, yes.
And I think from Mr. Wright's statement, you spoke to him about it.
I did.
I suppose it's worth thinking, what's the advantages and disadvantages of it? So thinking without the benefit of hindsight, because of course the pandemic is coming. At the time, what do you think were the benefits of going to stage 5?
I think at the time, and I accepted this when Mr. Wright put it to me, that I was considering stage 5 because I'd run out of patience with the health board. And I was at a point of, could we just get them out the road and let's get on and sort this? I'm sure I phrased it better at the time. And his view was, if I really did want to go to stage 5, then he was not going to stand in my way, but he did not think that that was wise, given the size and scale of Greater Glasgow and Clyde, and all the levels of healthcare that it provided, and the demand that would make on Scottish Government to take over all of that in its entirety, that the instability and uncertainty that would create was not necessarily the most helpful thing to do when you're trying to fix pressing issues of infection prevention and control.
What about going to stage 5, but in such a way that you could then put in people you chose to take responsibility of the day-to-day, put in a board of your own choosing, rather than you becoming responsible for every waiting list? And I suspect the voters probably thought you were anyway, but you're responsible for every waiting list and operation in the entire city.
Sure. I mean, that is what you would do. If a minister intervenes to escalate to level 5, which means the government is now taking over the running of that board, it's unlikely to be the actual cabinet secretary who's now running that board, and many would argue that's a very good thing indeed. So you would be looking to put in a smaller team, whatever it might be. I think even so, Mr. Wright's arguments carried a great deal of weight about the level of disruption and uncertainty that you would cause by doing so would detract from the effort and the focus that was needed to actually fix the pressing problems that you were trying to fix.
I wonder if we can look at paragraph 51, where we put to you the idea, perhaps naively, that a middle position might exist where you could remove the executive board members and leave everyone else in place. Now, you've responded, I don't see how that could assist. Executive members of health boards are employed by the health board, and either be a move to one single NHS employer, that would not be Scottish ministers. Now, firstly, what's that reference to a single NHS employer? Because
yes, so prior to the pandemic, work was underway with the support of all the relevant trade unions to create a single employer for all NHS employees, and overcome. So everyone who's employed in the NHS has the same terms and conditions, whether they work in Glasgow or Aberdeen or Shetland or wherever, for the role that they are employed to do. So there are national terms and conditions. However, what you have when you have 14 territorial health boards is that you can have disparity in the application of some of that between health boards, and that can cause difficulty. It is about how people interpret the rules. And we had a particular issue where the Royal College of Surgeons had a proposition which I thought was a very sensible proposition that would allow us to retain consultant surgeons coming to the end of their career with NHS who no longer wanted to be subject to the demands and pressures of the rota system, but equally didn't necessarily want to give up practice, which would allow them to be seconded, if you like, to some of our more rural and island health boards to undertake surgical procedures in the specialisms that they had that may not be available in those boards. We hit an obstacle. Now, though all of those individuals are necessarily subject to appropriate Disclosure Scotland procedures in the board that employs them, but that disclosure certificate was not being accepted in other boards because they did not employ them.
So this was a way of addressing that issue?
So that was an example of the kind of issue you get when boards stand on their high horse, I can think of no other way of describing it, as the employing authority.
Right.
So there was work, it had gone on, predated my appointment as Cabinet Secretary. There had been work, discussions and work ongoing to create a single NHS employer, as I say, with trade union support. And I suspect, had we not had the pandemic, we would have seen that work realised.
So the question I wanted to put to you beyond that was that if you had gone to stage 5, and it's still part of the framework, I understand, as an option, does the problem not actually that you've identified here still exist? Is if you take a health board to stage 5, all those executive directors are still employed by the health board on their terms and conditions. And whilst you may not want them to be chief executive or whatever, you can't just chuck them out. So actually, does stage 5 have a little bit of a problem in it, in that it's not quite as clean as it looks at first blush? Is that if you're right, and executive members of boards having employment rights would prevent an intermediate stage, it would prevent stage 5 as well, wouldn't it?
I'm not sure that it would.
Right.
To be honest, I can't be definite about that because we did not pursue going to stage 5. I accepted the perfectly reasonable case Mr. Wright made to me, but I'm not sure that it would, because I don't recall in the case of Argyll and Clyde that it prevented the then Cabinet Secretary from putting in place, if you like, a transition team,
Right,
as he dispersed the responsibilities between 2 other health boards. So it would certainly not be a situation without financial cost, as arguably other costs as well. But I don't think it necessarily precludes you from doing that.
The other question that arises from this discussion, which is in local authorities, senior officers of local authorities, such as the chief executive and the accounting officer, are not members of the authority, but they are in a health board. Have these events and the thought processes that you've gone through about escalation perhaps challenged the wisdom of making that corporate management team have this, to some extent, the same status as the board who's supposed to be scrutinising them?
I think that's a very interesting question, and I think it certainly has, to some extent, should initiate a serious review of whether or not that is a wise position to maintain. And part of the reason I say that is that I remember when I chaired the board of Golden Jubilee, having a discussion. It's not quite the same as you are suggesting, but having a discussion with the then chief executive about the size of the board, and in particular, the size of the executive team that attended board meetings. And her position was very clear, that she thought that the only two members of the executive team who needed to be at board meetings was the chief executive and the medical director. Because if the chief executive could not answer questions relating to nursing or finance or other matters, then he or she should not be the chief executive, which seemed perfectly right to me. You're suggesting a stage beyond that, which is that the executive team are not members of the board in the way that non-executive members are members of the board.
Yes, because if you go to a local authority, the chief executive is not a member of the council.
Yeah, and I can see value in that.
Paragraph 54 on page 115, you discuss still seeing resistance from GDC following escalation to stage 4 and a sense they're being unfairly dealt with. And you didn't see their attitude changing when the oversight board was in place. Now, you attend a board meeting, and we will in due course work out which one it was, and you presumably had a number of meetings. How did you attempt to address this resistance? Because ultimately, it's for you to explain your actions and that of the Director General.
Excuse me. So I think I attended 2 board meetings.
How did you put it to them?
In the sense of, why have we gone to stage 4?
Yes, and why they shouldn't have resistance.
I didn't put to them that they shouldn't have resistance. I put it to them what the arguments were for escalating them to stage 4 and what that then meant and what would then happen. The resistance I detected was in part from their response or non-response, I think probably is fair, but also in the many meetings I had with John Brown and Jane Grant.
Ms. Grant described the decision to escalate as a bit disappointing. Can you see why she might take that view?
No, I can't. I think she should not be disappointed by that decision, but should have been determined to respond positively to it.
The views you describe in paragraph 54 that didn't change when the oversight board was in place, did they have any effect, as far as you could see, on the oversight board's effectiveness?
Directly, no, I don't believe so. I think to a greater or lesser degree would made the oversight board's job a bit harder, but the better person to respond to that would be Professor McQueen.
Well, what I'm going to do is to move on to the work of the oversight board. and really to try and work out your assessment of the impact that the Oversight Board had on some issues. Conscious you're not a member of the Oversight Board, you set it up, and things happened in the world after it was set up. But if we look at your statement, paragraph 64, you describe having regular update meetings, page 119. And in paragraph 65, you describe continued reluctance to act in a way consistent with organisational duty of candour and to cooperate with Professor Craig White. But taken across the whole period of the Oversight Board's work, not jumping in halfway along, do you think the Oversight Board resolved the issues around duty of candour and indeed communications that Professor White was dealing with?
I think the Oversight Board and Professor White and the subgroup of that board that he chaired, I think by force of effort and persistence did resolve those issues for that patient cohort. Did that subsequently, when there was no Oversight Board, change the approach and performance of Greater Glasgow and Clyde to transparent and open communications? I am less confident that it made that change as a permanent change.
Can you explain why you're less confident?
Because subsequent to and it is for a short period, and I should be clear about that, between the Oversight Board completing its work and me stepping down as an elected politician in May 21, but also from the continuing discussions with both the chair and the chief executive, I did not believe at any point that they embraced the value of open and transparent communications. Let's set aside a statutory duty and concentrate on whether or not you see value in doing that and having that approach. And it was not my view that they saw the value of doing that approach in and of itself, other than the fact that if they didn't, they were going to get a row.
From Professor McQueen or you?
Me, probably.
Thinking about the whistleblowers, to what extent do you think Greater Glasgow and Clyde engaged with the concerns of the whistleblowers and indeed the encouragement of whistleblowing during the period of the Oversight Board?
So that's difficult in terms of Greater Glasgow and Clyde. That's difficult because the bulk of the time the Oversight Board was conducting its work. We were in the middle of a pandemic, and that board, in common with other boards and their staff, were exemplary in terms of NHS staff and how they responded to that pandemic, and that inevitably reduced their capacity to undertake fully other roles and responsibilities that they might otherwise have been expected to do. So I think it is difficult to say that their approach on whistleblowing could have substantially changed during that period. Whether or not it has done, it may well do now. I know that there is new leadership at Greater Glasgow and Clyde. The approach may well be very different, but similar to the statutory duty of candour and everything else that I have said in terms of continued reluctance, I'm not sure that I would be confident that the leadership of Greater Glasgow and Clyde at that time had a similar view to whistleblowing as I did, and that is that it is something to be welcomed and acted upon.
To what extent would you accept, looking at the whole Oversight Board Stage 4 process, to some extent was it a missed opportunity in that it may not, for some reasons you've already touched on, may not really have created a change in the culture of Greater Glasgow in respect of whistleblowing and disclosure. Example being the HIS report into the A&E consultants that's just come out.
I don't think it is fair, even if you set aside a pandemic. If we imagine that the pandemic had never happened, I don't think it is fair to put responsibility for changing the culture, the long-standing culture in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, from the leadership all the way through. And of course, that is how culture works. It follows what is happening at the top. I don't think it is fair to put that responsibility on an oversight board set up effectively for a time-limited period to undertake specific pieces of work. If we had not had a pandemic, I think shortly before 2020, following NHS Highland, I think this date is right. This definitely happened. I think the date is roughly right. I had a meeting with health boards, unions, staff associations, and I think some others, to begin to look at how do we improve the culture of our NHS, on the presumption that NHS Highland was not a one-off. To the extent that it existed in NHS Highland, that may be extreme, but generally speaking, it could not reasonably be considered to be a one-off. That work was not progressed by me for obvious reasons, but it was a recognition, and I said that I would have wanted to have a rerun of a version of Stark for Greater Glasgow and Clyde. That was a recognition by me that cultural change was absolutely essential, but it was a long piece of work. It's not something that you can achieve overnight or even in the course of a few months.
Conscious that we're talking about hypotheticals because it didn't happen. That process you had in mind, if it's a form of Sturrock, John Sturrock conducted an investigation, he spoke to people, he produced a report. Can cultural change come about simply by the production of external reports, or does it require change of leadership?
Yes, it can't come about by the production of reports. It absolutely requires to be led and exemplified by leadership. And by that I mean people need to see from the top of the organisation all the way through, in practice, the values of the organisation being made operational. In other words, they need to see leadership that says everyone is valued, all the roles matter, all ideas are welcome, and all complaints are welcome. And we will treat each other consistently with respect.
Can I show you a document for one of the Edinburgh 3 bundles? It's Edinburgh 3, Bundle 13, Volume 10, Document 21, page 158. Yes, it's a letter from you to Dr. Inkster and Dr. Peters on the 10th of August. Now, the letter follows the launching of the inquiry. And you explain that they've met Professor McQueen, and you say in the third paragraph, "I'm sorry you've not been involved as you would have thought appropriate in the work of the Oversight Board. And she has assured me that all your concerns are acted upon within the overall, she will ensure that all your concerns are acted on with the overall remit of the Oversight Board. Fiona is aware of the need to ensure that concerns about previously issued responses to questions from parents and insurance on the effective delivery of action plans you mentioned remain outstanding." Now, does the issue that prompted this and this reply effectively reflect a relatively limited input from their point of view of Dr. Peters and Dr. Inkster into the Oversight Board. That was their concern. They weren't getting proper input. You accept that?
Their concern, as I understood it, was that their input was not as great as they believed it should be.
How did you accept that, or do you think that was mistaken or overstated? Or
I discussed it with Professor McQueen, and it seemed to me that the approach that she was taking, which was, as this letter said, to be sending drafts of documents to them in order to secure their comments and feedback, was a good approach, was a way of involving them without them being members of the Oversight Board, which is perhaps what they might have wanted. I don't know that for sure. But I thought that a great deal of effort was genuinely going into making sure that that their concerns were being addressed, but also that the expertise that they had was being harnessed in the most appropriate way to help the work of the Oversight Board.
now I want to move on to another topic. This is a hypothetical question, which I've been asked to put to you. And I appreciate, take it off the screen, please. I appreciate you were not in office or even an MSP in the summer of 2015. And this is a hypothetical question, which you may wish to answer. Had you been in office at Cabinet Secretary, with all the knowledge that you have now, and perhaps more importantly, the knowledge you had at the time of going to stage 4, would you have allowed the hospital to open? I mean, you didn't allow the Edinburgh to open, so it seems in one way an appropriate question.
Yes, I understand that it is. If all the knowledge that I had at stage 4 includes the DMA Canyon report,
It does.
I would not have allowed the hospital to open, though.
Again, if you'd discovered all that and had access to the knowledge of the DMA Canyon report, would you have attempted to escalate the board to stage 5 or remove the chief executive back then?
In 2015.
2015, if you'd known that? Or is that a little bit disproportionate?
I think that is too hypothetical for me, because I would not, even with the knowledge and the reports and so on, I would not be hearing from the then chief executive and chair.
Of course. Let's turn to the case notes review, which you established on the 20th of January 2020. Now, we have the official report of your announcement, Bundle 52, Volume 7, Document 46, page 387. And I think it starts at page 39 of that document, so that will be page 416. I really hope that my maths has done that right. No, it's not. Back 10 pages, please. Stop. 39. There we are. One more page. 409. No, I've got completely lost. I think I'll do this from memory. What do you think was the principal purpose of the case notes review from your point of view?
So, following the publication of the independent review, a number of families still felt that they hadn't had answers to their specific cases. What had happened to their child? Why had that happened? And was there anything about the building that had contributed to or caused harm? And so it seemed to me that in those circumstances, if it's at all possible to provide answers, then individuals should have those. And that the best way to do that then was to have an independent case note review, because we're looking at historical cases, a case note review, and to have that conducted independent of government, of the Health Board, and indeed of NHS Scotland. Hence the appointment or the ask of Professor Mike Stevens and Gaynor Evans to oversee that review and reach views on the case notes that came to them. Professor Bain, if you like, did the hard work of pulling all the cases and the information and so on together, but the case note review and the conclusions of that review were those of Professor Stevens and Gaynor Evans.
And Professor Wilcox.
And Professor Wilcox, yes.
I wonder if we can go to paragraph 77 of your statement on page 126. We asked you about the decision to keep the individual reports confidential, and you've suggested that it was a decision made by Professor Stevens.
Yes.
He thinks it was a decision made by the Scottish Government.
Okay.
Can you help us about... I mean, it may well have a logical reason to do with trust. I appreciate that. But can you recollect whether you had anything involved in making the decision to do it this way?
No, I didn't. I know I did not have any involvement in that. I remember the conversation with Professor Stevens when we were asking him to undertake this role, because I remember saying to him, what you do and how you go about it is entirely for you to decide. This needs to be independent of me, of the NHS in Scotland, of Mr. Wright, of the board. You need to do it the way that you think is best. And so I then had nothing to do with the approach and the methodology that that was used, and quite rightly so, in my opinion. I understood when I saw the report and so on how they had gone about their work, but the confidentiality aspect, as far as I was concerned at the time and still, was a decision of those leading the case note review.
A disadvantage, or two disadvantages that occur to me, of that process, of having the 118 reports confidential, is firstly, this inquiry can't see them. But the other is that the Greater Glasgow and Clyde Health Board never saw them. Did it occur to you at the time that having the work of the case notes review containing confidential conclusions might ultimately, to some extent, inform the health board's later actions to decide that one couldn't rely on the case notes review?
No, because it didn't inform their earlier actions to fully accept the conclusions and recommendations of the case note review. So given that situation and with respect to confidentiality pertained at the time when the report was finalised, published, and Greater Glasgow did not see any of that as preventing them from accepting the conclusions and recommendations, I'm puzzled as to why that should suddenly produce an obstacle to them.
I don't know whether I need to go to it, but their press statement doesn't accept the conclusions, it just accepts the recommendations and produces an apology.
Yes.
Is that a nuance that you noticed at the time?
I did.
Did you raise it with them?
No.
No. You say in paragraph 81 on page 127, I expect they accepted them, by which you mean the conclusions, because they didn't want to have a row with me. Might it have helped in the long run if you had pressed them on their absence of overt exceptions of the conclusions? It might have resulted in a row that day, but it might have saved some time later on.
No, what I was concerned about was that they accepted the recommendations. I mean, I think it's really difficult to separate the two. Recommendations come from conclusions. I think you're dancing on the head of a pin if you say we accept the recommendations but not the conclusions. That seems to me a rather strange place to put yourself. So whether or not they said they accepted the conclusions, I think it is reasonable for me to presume that you do if you accept the recommendations. What I am referring to here is if they had at the time taken the position they are reported to have subsequently taken, in that they are questioning the report, that would have been a different situation for me to deal with.
Since we're in the game of hypotheticals, what do you think might have happened?
I think I would have, by that stage, well, first of all, I'd want to see what was their evidence for not accepting the conclusions and recommendations. What was the basis for that, given the eminence and the track record of Professor Stevens and the others involved with him? And if I did not believe that their position was justified, then we would have had to have a very serious conversation about the chair and the chief executive remaining in post.
Well, that enables me to ask a couple of questions, because we obviously have their evidence now, and I'd like to find out from you whether at the time either of them expressed the position they've set out in their evidence to you. It may be they didn't, but it'd be interesting.
No, they didn't.
Because Ms. Grant explained that they accepted the recommendations but did not explicitly accept or reject the conclusions. Did she explain that to you?
No.
No. Professor Brown told us on Friday last week, the board always accepted the conclusions, and he seemed surprised that we would ask. Did he express that to you at the time?
No.
The new chief executive gave evidence yesterday. Her understanding is that GDC did accept the conclusions and the recommendations together. In the actual statement at the time, did they do that? Did they say that?
I think their news release talks about the recommendations.
But it doesn't talk about the conclusions.
It doesn't talk about the conclusions, but I suspect, as I've said, that it is hard for a rational view to separate recommendations that flow from conclusions.
So I've got a couple of final questions. The first is, given we've had a discussion about whether you could have gone to stage 4 earlier, and what you said about that, and given we've had a discussion about why the Oversight Board didn't include explicit control over the water system, remediation, the ventilation system, and you've given an answer about that, do you think there's any apology owed by the Scottish Government? I recognise you can't speak for them now, but if you think back to your leadership role at the time, for not taking earlier action to the parents and families?
From memory, in fact, I am certain of this, I apologised through the Scottish Parliament to patients and families affected by all of this, and directly to the families that I met for the situation that they had been put in. I don't think I would expect Scottish Government to apologise for not acting sooner, because I think a better position is for government to consider whether or not the role that it directly plays in the procurement, as we've discussed, certainly of major capital builds, is something it should undertake. I do think that there are arguments to review in our health boards the various schemes of delegation that exist, because it does seem to me that schemes of delegation can become proxies for not being accountable, and that we should be ensuring that our boards understand that governance is an active process, not a paper schematic.
Well, there's two further questions I have, one of which arises from that, which is, to what extent do you have a concern about information flows in health boards, in that the executive team are the people who control the information, and the non-executive members simply receive reports through committees and have a relatively limited access to information about events within the board?
Yeah, I think that is a problem. And I have seen when even in a relatively small board in terms of its size, when I became chair of Golden Jubilee, the bundle of papers for a standard board meeting was at least 2/3 of the size of this folder.
An inch or so, 2 inches.
An inch to 2 inches of papers, much greater for our territorial boards, which cover larger areas. The idea that a non-executive is going to plough their way through all of that, understand it, and formulate supportive and challenging questions from it is unlikely.
Right.
So I think boards should look at how they conduct their business in a way to make it accessible for non-executive members who are essentially lay members to familiarise themselves as far as possible with the operation of the board, the key issues, have all the information they need in a format that is accessible and easily understood, and that the board meetings are conducted in a way that encourage question and challenge. And that includes board committees. I do have a view that we arguably have too many committees and subcommittees in our health boards. Again, a bit like the scheme of delegation. I think through no ill intent, information and matters can slip down between various committees because there's too many of them and the information flow isn't good enough between them. So I think there is a need to look at the organisational structure of our health boards. That is different from my view that we have too many of them. Assume that we keep all. Look at the organisational structure, the number of committees, and determine whether they are all needed or whether they delay decision making and remove it too far from the front line, and look at what needs to be done to allow non-executive members to actively engage in their role of constructive challenge and scrutiny.
Which brings me to my final question. What do you say to patients and families who feel that the health board, and to some extent the Scottish Government, failed to protect them and provide timely and honest information about risks in the Queen Elizabeth?
What I would say is that I completely understand why they feel like that. I think to a significant extent they are justified in that feeling. And that there is no excuse for that having been the case. There may be reasons, there may be legitimate actions subsequently taken to try to redress that, but that doesn't remove the additional burden of anxiety that those patients and family faced at a time when they had enough anxiety and worry to deal with.
Thank you. My Lord, those are all the questions I have for Ms. Freeman, but I suspect it'd be a good idea if I might have some minutes to check with the rest of the room to see any further questions.
Ms. Freeman, as you may recollect, our procedure is that at the end of a witness's evidence, counsel take the opportunity to check with colleagues as to whether there are further questions. Should take no more than 10 minutes,
No, that's
but can I invite you to return to the
Of course. Please stand.
Mr. McIntosh.
I've got about 7 questions, I think.
Perhaps a further 7 questions.
So one of them I think I partially asked, but I'm not sure I've asked it quite the way the person who invented it would like me to have asked it. I think it's worth asking properly. During your tenure as Cabinet Secretary, what steps did you take to satisfy yourself that the ventilation system in the adult BMT ward, that's Ward 4B at the Queen Elizabeth, met the relevant standards in SHTMO 301 for immunocompromised patients?
I'm not sure that I can recall detailed steps in that regard. I know, have raised that with both the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Nursing Officer, and they will have then used the relevant agencies, Health Inspection Scotland being one, or Health Facilities Scotland perhaps being the other, to begin to make those checks. But as best as I can recall, that would be what I would have done.
Do you recollect being told that the retrofitted Ward 4B did not achieve the full standard for a neutropenic ward, in that it had only 6 rather than 10 air changes? It didn't have HEPA filtration in its corridor.
I don't recollect being told that, no.
Thinking about NHS Assure for a moment, I'm not going to put to you what actually happened in terms of its interactions with Greater Glasgow and Clyde at the end of the Ward 2A retrofit project, partly because of time, but also you weren't Cabinet Secretary at the time. But given that the work was underway, or at least in contemplation, when you announced NHS Assure as an idea, what sort of things did you expect that organisation to be doing towards the end of a project to provide assurance that it was built to the right standards?
I would expect the organisation to undertake a site visit and check.
Are you envisaging literally one visit or something more sophisticated than that?
Well, it depends on the organisation exercising its own expertise, whether or not it requires one or more site visits, whether it requires site of documentation. But I would expect it to actively check whether the relevant standards had been met.
Do you have confidence that the NHS Assure that has been created will prevent similar failures in water and ventilation systems in future buildings?
I'm sorry, I can't answer that, because it is now 4 years since I demitted public office. I have had no involvement with the actual creation of NHS Assure. And so I don't know and can't comment on whether it has been established in the manner that I envisaged. So I can't express confidence or a lack of confidence in that regard.
Now, I've been asked to put to you that despite representations by Professor Cudahy, there remains on the Scottish Government website inaccurate information in the timelines about microbacterial cases in the Shahalian unit. Is that something you were aware of when you were, it arises out of an oversight board timeline? Is that something you were aware of when you were Cabinet Secretary?
No.
Thinking about events in 2009, when of course you were not involved in this project, how would you react to the information that the procurement of the new South Glasgow Hospital was not routinely reported to the main GGC board, but to a subcommittee called the Performance Review Group throughout the 2009-10 period when key decisions were being made? And would that make any difference?
A strange position that I would not understand, and I do think that would make a difference because I'm not sure how the board could exercise its responsibility of scrutiny and governance if it was not receiving that information directly.
Final question relates, I think we discussed whether the oversight board escalation should have explicitly referenced culture. And you talked about your idea and contemplation of a larger but equivalent of the historic review in Glasgow, and also wider issues and activity at a national level. And you explained how the pandemic would have intervened. I've been asked to put to you this. In the world of infection prevention control, is it actually worth remembering that culture and a willingness to listen to divergent opinions is actually an inherent part of safe infection prevention and control? And therefore, it's not possible to divide the two and see them separately, as perhaps you might have intended to at the time.
My answer to that is yes, it is part of it. I don't think I divided them separately in the sense of not seeing them as unrelated to each other. But in terms of the volume of work or the scale of work necessary to change the long-standing culture of Greater Glasgow and Clyde, to improve that culture, I think dealing with those issues separately, albeit in parallel, which was my intent, would have been the right way to deal with it.
You may just glance at my colleagues who suggested these questions. I think, my lord, I have no further questions for this witness.
Thank you, Ms. McIntosh. Ms. Freeman, no further questions, therefore you're free to go. But before you do go, can I thank you for your second attendance at a hearing of the inquiry, and for the preparation that clearly went behind that in considering documents and providing a number of witness statements in respect of the Edinburgh Hospital and the two Glasgow hospitals. But you're now free to go with my thanks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lord Brodie. That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Ms. McIntosh.
My lord, that includes the evidence that Mr. Connell and I proposed to lead in the hearing sessions in respect to the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, Royal Hospital for Children. In respect to the Glasgow part of the inquiry, my lord has heard 29 weeks of evidence, 20 weeks of that since 19th August last year, and has heard either in person or by statement from 186 witnesses, 131 of them since 19th of August last year. The inquiry team has produced 6 provisional position papers and 128 bundles of evidence in respect to this hospital. There remain a number of outstanding witness statements that have been sought following evidence in this hearing. Some come up in the last few days. The inquiry team will write to core participants in the coming days to update them on the status of these and when we anticipate to receive them. And we'll probably write again the following week. The next stage in terms of Direction 12 is for the Council to the inquiry team to produce our closing statement by the 21st November, and core participants then have until the 19th of December to lodge their closing statements. Can I reassure my lord that the Council team have been working on drafts of key sections for some months now? I understand that these closing statements should contain all issues that we wish to raise in submission in respect to this hospital. And it's our intention to set out which parts of our former closing statement in respect of Glasgow 3 remain relevant and where our position has developed. Now, to some extent, the Council team's approach has been to investigate events through the medium of asking questions and listening to evidence, rather than, as it were, knowing everything before evidence is led. I'd like to offer my thanks to all the witnesses for their patients when faced with long document lists and questions not raised with them in their original questionnaires or requests for statements. I'd also like to record my thanks on behalf of the council team as a whole to the inquiry staff who've worked with us to deliver these hearings, and to the legal representatives or core participants for their assistance in identifying questions that needed to be asked, and for their good humour in the face of early starts and the occasional late document. But that is all the evidence we intend to lead.
Thank you, Mr. McIntosh. In what I have to say, in marking the fact that we've reached a very significant point in the progress of this inquiry, I'm very conscious that my audience, while including everyone in this room, also includes those who've been following our proceedings on YouTube. And therefore, I perhaps may just say a little more than might otherwise be necessary in respect of the well-informed audience in front of me in Edinburgh. As it appears from its remit, the purpose of this inquiry is to determine how issues relating to adequacy of ventilation, water contamination, and other matters adversely impacting on patient safety and care occurred, if these issues could have been prevented, the impact of these issues on parents and families, and whether the buildings provide a suitable environment for the delivery of safe, effective, person-centered care. Now, looking back to the first of the oral hearings in relation to the Glasgow hospitals, which began on the 21st of September of 2021, I saw it as appropriate to begin by hearing from patients and family members of these patients who'd been affected by the issues arising on the Queen Elizabeth campus. We've ended this hearing by hearing the evidence of present and former senior figures in NHS GGC, NHS, NSS, and Scottish Government. But I should make it clear that the need for a focus on the delivery of safe, effective, person-centered care means that the experience and interests of patients and their families remains very much at the centre of my consideration of the questions that face the inquiry. Now, Mr. McIntosh has explained that we have now heard from all the witnesses who will give oral evidence. We've also taken evidence in the form of witness statements which appear on the website. There are some to be added to that list, and that will happen within the next week or so. The evidence gathering stage of the inquiry has accordingly been completed. This is, as Mr. McIntosh has already acknowledged, involved an enormous amount of work on the part of the inquiry team and the core participants and their legal representatives. Now, for all that work, I am very grateful. However, the work of the inquiry is not completed. As, again, Mr. McIntosh reminded us, I have still to hear closing statements, written closing statements from counsel to the inquiry and core participants. And it is on the basis of these closing statements that I will be offered an assessment and analysis of all the evidence that has been heard. It is with the assistance of these closing statements that I will be preparing a report for submission to the Cabinet Secretary. I cannot understate the importance of these closing statements. I've heard a lot of evidence, but I need the help of core participants through their legal representatives by setting out in closing statements their perspectives on that evidence, their analysis of that evidence, and what they consider to be the important issues. Now, can I turn to Direction 12, which was issued on the 1st of September of this year? In that, I attempt to set out guidance as to what I would wish to receive, or strictly speaking, the solicitor to the inquiry to receive by the end of business on the 19th of December of this year. Can I begin by drawing attention to paragraphs 4.1 and 4.5, where it's set out that where a core participant wishes to adopt, amend, or supersede the terms of a previously submitted closing statement, they should do so expressly. And in 4.5, where a preliminary position paper issued by the inquiry or expert report or a core participant's previous response to a preliminary position paper or expert report is referred to or relied on, the relevant passage or passages should be identified by bundle, page, and paragraph number. At the risk of repetition, it is important that core participants who wish to rely on previous submissions that they've made should do so in a precise way so that I can have a clear idea of what the final position of the core participant is. In paragraphs 4.6 and 4.7, there is guidance on circumstances where core participants refer to particular documents. And I would commend what is said there to the attention of those preparing closing written statements. Finally, on the topic of written closing statements, the evidence has not been all to the same effect. And accordingly, as is set out in section 5 of Direction 12, where a core participant wishes to reach a conclusion on a matter where there is a range of potentially inconsistent evidence, or where they would wish me to reach a conclusion which is different from that proposed by counsel to the inquiry in their written closing statements, that should be made clear in core participants' closing statements. They should set out the terms of the conclusions that they submit I should reach, and make specific reference to documents, statements, evidence which they consider support their submission. As Direction 12 sets out, we will reconvene for an oral hearing, after which will be at a date after which I will have had the opportunity to consider the written closing statements, but we will reconvene to hear oral closing statements on the 20th, 21st, 22nd, and 23rd of January of next year. And after I have heard everything that is said, I shall give it consideration together with not only the evidence, but the written statements discussing that evidence. Can I end by repeating my thanks to all the witnesses who've given evidence, to all the core participants who have participated in the inquiry, to their legal representatives, and to the inquiry team. As I say, a great deal of work has been necessary to make these hearings happen, and it's only been by dint of the work of a great many people diligently carried out that we've been able to complete these hearings. So can I emphasize my thanks to all those who've been involved. We'll reconvene on the 20th of January 2026 in order to hear oral submissions. But until then, can I wish you a good afternoon, and we shall see each other in the new year. Thank you.
Please stand.